trembles with the rising heat of the Pacific sun. On the runway of Tobera Airfield, a formation of Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters waits, slender, elegant, and lethal. Their engines cough to life, their silver fuselages gleaming under the morning haze. Inside one cockpit, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Shindo, an ace of the Imperial Japanese Navy, smirks as he looks over a stack of intelligence reports freshly decoded from the Pacific. New American carrier fighter, Grumman F6F Hellcat, he mutters. He laughs softly. Another fat cat from the Americans. Too slow, too heavy. The laughter spreads across the ready room. To the pilots of Japan, the Zero is the undisputed ruler of the skies. Since 1941, it had shredded every Allied fighter it faced, from the P-40 Warhawk over China to the F-4F Wildcat over Wake Island. The Japanese ace pilots, forged in years of war, had mastered the art of aerial combat. Their light, maneuverable fighters danced through the sky like blades in the wind. But thousands of miles away, across the ocean, a new kind of beast was being born. In Bethpage, New York, inside the sprawling Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, engineers worked day and night. Oil-stained uniforms, cigarettes smoldering on drafting tables. The smell of aluminum and sweat filled the air. In the center of the chaos stood Leroy Grumman himself, a quiet man with the eyes of an engineer and the instincts of a warrior. He wasn't building a beauty. He was building a survivor. The F6F Hellcat wasn't sleek like the Zero. It wasn't agile or graceful. It was massive, a brute of a machine with armor plating thicker than anything that had flown from a carrier before. Its heart was the Pratt Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower. When the throttle opened, the aircraft didn't purr. It roared. Grumman's philosophy was simple. Make it strong, make it fast, make it bring our boys home. The U.S. Navy demanded a fighter that could dominate the Pacific, one that could take hits, dive hard, climb fast, and strike back with fury. The Hellcat was that answer. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, American pilots were dying in F-4F Wildcats, brave but outmatched. The Zero could outclimb, outturn, and outshoot almost anything it met. The Navy needed a miracle, and by late 1943, it was on the way, carried across the Pacific on the decks of carriers like USS Essex and USS Yorktown. The first Hellcats arrived quietly. Few noticed. When the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy spotted the bulky new aircraft, they laughed. They looked like flying barrels, one pilot joked. But what they didn't know, what no one yet understood, was that the age of the Zero was ending. The storm was coming, and it wore the wings of a Hellcat. Section 2. Baptism of Fire. September 1st, 1943. Marcus Island, Central Pacific. The dawn broke with a red horizon. On the deck of the USS Yorktown, CV-10, a line of Grumman F6F Hellcats waited, their folded wings rising like armored beasts preparing for release. Deck crews in stained life vests ran between the fighters, checking fuel lines, arming 50 caliber Browning machine guns and shouting through the thunder of engines. The first real test of the Hellcat was minutes away. Lieutenant James Jimmy Flatley, callsign Fido, stood beside his aircraft, helmet under one arm. A veteran of the Coral Sea and Midway, he'd seen what the Zero could do, and what it could destroy. He remembered the thin skin of the Wildcat, the desperate turns, the hopeless climbs. But as he looked at the Hellcat beside him, something felt different. It wasn't sleek, it wasn't pretty. but it looked angry. "All right, boys," Flatley shouted over the rising roar. "Let's show 'em what American iron can do." At 0600 hours, the first Hellcats roared down the flight deck and hurled themselves into the Pacific air. Their engines screamed against the rising sun as they climbed toward Marcus Island, a small Japanese outpost bristling with anti-aircraft guns and radar towers. The Japanese scrambled to respond. Within minutes, a squadron of Zeros clawed into the sky from their airfield, twisting toward the oncoming formation. Through the gun sights of a Zero, the Hellcat seemed sluggish,
Enemy
big,
UAV overhead.
a perfect target. The Japanese pilots smiled. Then, everything changed. When the first bullets struck, the Hellcat didn't shatter, it absorbed the punishment. Armor plating shrugged off 7.7mm rounds that would have torn the Wildcat apart. Then, with a deep growl, the Hellcat dove. The Pratt Whitney engine screamed as it dropped, picking up speed like a falling meteor. The Zero followed, but too late. The Hellcat's dive speed was unmatched. It flipped upward, catching its pursuer in the crosshairs. 6 streams of .50 caliber fire erupted in a blinding flash. The Zero burst into flame and spiraled down into the sea. In the next 15 minutes, 6 Japanese fighters were destroyed, for no American losses. When Flatley landed back on Yorktown, the deck erupted in cheers. Mechanics ran forward, their faces streaked with oil and salt. The Hellcats were peppered with bullet holes, but not one was lost. That night, Flatley wrote in his logbook, "She's not a cat, she's a tiger with wings." Word spread fast through the Pacific Fleet. The Navy finally had a fighter that could match and surpass the Zero. But in Tokyo, disbelief ruled. Reports from Marcus Island were dismissed as exaggerated. Japanese commanders insisted it was luck, a fluke. They didn't realize that the Americans had found their equalizer. From that day forward, the Hellcat became the sharp edge of America's counterattack. It was just the beginning. The real war in the skies of the Pacific was about to begin, and the laughing was over. Section 3. The Turning Tide. January 4th, 1944. Over Rabaul, New Britain, the tropical air shimmered with the haze of smoke and oil. Below, the Japanese stronghold of Rabaul burned. Hangars cracked open, fuel depots exploding into plumes of black fire. Above, the roar of Hellcats filled the sky. The beasts had come to hunt. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, Air Group Commander aboard USS Essex, scanned the chaos below through his canopy. His voice crackled over the radio. "All units, engage bandits. Watch your 6. Let's clean this place up." The radio erupted with replies as squadrons of F6Fs peeled from formation, diving through the clouds like hawks upon prey. Below them, Japanese A6M Zeros rose desperately from Rabaul's runways, twisting into the sunlight, a last stand against an enemy they no longer understood. For years, the Zero had been Japan's crown jewel, light, nimble, elegant. But the Hellcat was something new. It was brutal, forgiving, built for men who fought hard and lived harder. A Zero could turn tighter, yes, but the Hellcat could take a hit, dive, and strike back. It was the brawler in a bar fight, not the duelist with a rapier. As the battle raged, McCampbell rolled his fighter into a steep dive, the G-forces pressing him into his seat. A Zero flashed past his right wing, its guns blazing. Tracers tore through the air, striking his fuselage. But the armor held. McCampbell pulled up hard, looped behind the Zero, and squeezed the trigger. 6 .50 caliber Brownings thundered to life. The Japanese plane burst into flames and disintegrated mid-air. "Scratch one, Zeke," McCampbell murmured, his voice steady. From above, the Pacific sky looked like a shattered mirror, contrails twisting like smoke serpents, flames reflecting off the water below. Hellcats moved in packs using coordinated attacks that overwhelmed their opponents. Japanese pilots, trained for one-on-one dogfights, found themselves trapped in a new kind of warfare. Industrial, relentless, and mechanical. Back in Rabaul's control bunker, Commander Tetsuo Iwamoto, one of Japan's finest aces, watched the battle unfold through binoculars. He slammed his fist against the table. "These new Grummons, they don't die," he spat. "Our bullets mean nothing to them." By the end of the day, 56 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The Americans lost 5. It wasn't just a victory. It was a revelation. The Hellcat had proven itself beyond question. For every American pilot lost, 19 Japanese never returned. It was a ratio so staggering that even the Imperial Navy could no longer ignore it. The myth of the invincible Zero had been broken. Back on USS Essex, the deck smelled of burnt oil and salt spray. Mechanics patched holes and loaded ammunition as pilots leaned against their planes, drinking coffee and staring at the sea. The laughter of the Japanese aces in 1943 was now an echo, fading into the dark waters of the Pacific. The tide of war had turned, not with a new bomb, not with a new tactic, but with a machine that embodied America itself. Simple, strong, and mercilessly efficient. In the months ahead, the Hellcat would sweep across the Pacific like a steel storm, from the Marshalls to the Marianas, from Truk to the Philippines, until the rising sun itself began to set. The empire that once ruled the air was falling, 1-0 at a time. Section 4. The Day of Reckoning. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. The horizon shimmered in the heat, a flat, endless expanse of blue. Beneath it moved the greatest armada the world had ever seen. 15 American aircraft carriers, their decks crowded with hundreds of Hellcats, Avengers, and Dauntlesses. On this day, the U.S. Navy wasn't defending anymore. It was hunting. At 0900 hours, radar operators aboard the USS Lexington picked up a massive wave approaching from the west. 300 enemy aircraft, heading straight for the fleet. The message crackled across every ship in Task Force 58. Bandits inbound, bearing 270, distance 150 miles. In the ready rooms, pilots tightened their gloves and checked their gear. Among them was Lieutenant Alexander Varachu, a 25-year-old ace from Indiana. Calm, focused, and utterly fearless. He climbed into his F6F Hellcat and looked down the deck, where the ocean met the sky. "Let's go get him," he whispered. The Hellcats roared off the carriers, one after another, engines howling like thunder rolling over water. They climbed into the sun, into the blinding light where every second meant life or death. Then they saw them. The Japanese force. Hundreds of A6M Zeros, Judy dive bombers, and Kate torpedo planes, filling the sky like a swarm of black dots on blue glass. It was the largest air battle the Pacific had ever seen. The Hellcats dove first.
Enemy UAV overhead.
From 25,000 feet, Varachu rolled into a steep dive, closing on a formation of bombers heading for the carriers. His guns roared, 6 .50 calibers spitting fire. The first bomber exploded in a burst of smoke and flame. He swung to the next, lined up, and fired again. In less than 8 minutes, 6 Japanese planes went down. Below, the U.S. fleet maneuvered like a machine of steel and precision. Anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with black bursts of flak, the smell of cordite mixing with salt air. But most of the work was done by the Hellcats. They cut through the Japanese squadrons with terrifying efficiency, diving, rolling, climbing back into formation. Radio chatter was constant. "Splash 1! 2 bandits on fire! They're falling like flies!" The Japanese pilots, many barely trained replacements, never stood a chance. Their planes were light, fast, and deadly in the right hands. But now, against Hellcats with radar guidance, armor plating, and overwhelming numbers, the Zero's grace had turned into fragility. By sunset, the battle was over. The sea below burned with the wreckage of 300 Japanese aircraft. The Americans had lost barely 24. Reporters would later call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The sky that had once belonged to the rising sun was now an American domain. When Vracheu landed on USS Lexington, deck crews met him with cheers. His Hellcat was scorched, riddled with holes, but it had brought him home. Again. He climbed out of the cockpit, sweat dripping, and grinned. That's for Pearl Harbor. That day, Japan lost not only its finest pilots, but its last hope of regaining air superiority. From that moment forward, the Imperial Navy could only fight and die beneath a sky owned by the Hellcat. The laughter that once echoed from Rabaul and Truk was gone. All that remained was silence, and the distant sound of engines roaring toward Japan. Section 5. The Empire in Retreat. October 24th, 1944. Over Leyte Gulf, the Philippines. The sky was thick with smoke and the smell of burning fuel. Below, the waters of Leyte Gulf churned to chaos. The Japanese Navy's final gamble to destroy the American invasion fleet. Massive plumes of black smoke rose from burning cruisers, while columns of American ships returned fire with blazing anti-aircraft batteries. Above this inferno, the Hellcats reigned. Commander David McCampbell, now the Navy's leading ace, banked his aircraft into the rising sun. His radio buzzed. "Hellcats, this is Essex Control. 30-plus enemy planes inbound bearing 150. McCampbell looked across the horizon. Tiny silver dots were forming, approaching fast. Zeeks, Vals, and Judy bombers, all diving straight toward the American carriers. It was the desperate heart of Japan's last offensive, and it was about to end in fire. He pressed the throttle forward. The Pratt Whitney engine roared to life, propellers screaming. "Let's go hunting," he muttered. At 22,000 feet, McCampbell and his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, dove into the formation. The first burst of .50 caliber fire tore through a Judy bomber's cockpit, sending it spiraling into the sea. McCampbell rolled, fired again, another explosion. Another explosion. The Pacific shimmered below as wreckage burned across the waves. Within 30 minutes, McCampbell had shot down 9 enemy aircraft, a single-day record. The men aboard USS Essex watched
Enemy
from
UAV
below,
overhead.
counting each kill through binoculars. One officer whispered, almost in disbelief, "One man. He's fighting an entire air force." But the victory was not without cost. For every Japanese plane destroyed, a young pilot died. Many barely trained, some flying without radios, others carrying just enough fuel for a one-way trip. By this point, Japan's once elite Air Corps had been bled dry. Veterans were gone, replaced by boys who had never even fired in combat. Back in the enemy's command center, Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa stood over a map of the Philippine Sea, his hands trembling. His carrier force, once the pride of the empire, was being annihilated. The voices on the radio grew desperate. "We are under attack from hundreds of Hellcats! Where is our air cover?" There was none left. When night fell, the Campbell squadron returned to Essex, their aircraft streaked with oil and powder burns. Deck crews met them with silence and awe. McCampbell climbed from his Hellcat, exhausted, his face streaked with sweat and salt. He glanced at the kill tally chalked on the fuselage. 34 confirmed victories. He didn't smile. He simply said, "They fought bravely, but it's over now." And he was right. The Hellcat had done more than win battles. It had broken Japan's air power. From the Coral Sea to the Philippines, the F6F had carved a path of dominance unmatched in aviation history. In less than 2 years, the aircraft mocked as too heavy, too slow had achieved the impossible. Over 5,200 aerial victories, the highest of any Allied fighter in the Pacific. The Zero, once the symbol of Japan's invincibility, was now a relic scattered across the waves. As the smoke cleared over Leyte Gulf, the Pacific lay open. The sky, once ruled by the rising sun, now belonged to a new kind of warrior, forged in steel, powered by fire, and flown by men who never stopped climbing. The Hellcat had not just turned the tide of war. It had rewritten the very balance of power in the Pacific. Section 6. The Psychology of Power. November 1944. Aboard USS Enterprise, somewhere in the Philippine Sea. The sun was low over the horizon, its reflection glittering off the carrier deck like liquid fire. Rows of F6F Hellcats stood ready, their blue-gray fuselages scarred by salt, smoke, and victory. Ground crews worked silently, wiping down canopies, refueling tanks, chalking kill marks on the sides of aircraft. Each symbol was a story, each scratch a ghost. In the ready room, the pilots sat in half-light, their faces lit by the glow of flickering projectors. On the screen before them, reconnaissance photos of Japan, Tokyo, Yokosuka, Okinawa. The next chapter of the war had begun. Lieutenant Bob Burnell, barely 24, leaned forward and whispered to the man beside him, "They said we'd be dead in 6 months back in 42. Now look at us." His squadron commander, Commander Ralph Weymouth, didn't reply. He just nodded, eyes fixed on the map. He knew what Burnell didn't. Dominance brought a new kind of burden. For 2 years, American pilots had fought an enemy that believed in divine destiny, in death before dishonor. Now those same men, broken and beaten, were surrendering mid-air or diving their crippled planes into the sea rather than face capture. The Empire's spirit was faltering, and everyone could feel it. But war had no mercy for the victors either. When the deck alarm sounded, the men rose without a word. The roar of engines filled the air once again. The first Hellcat thundered down the deck, its tail lifting,
Enemy UAV
propeller
overhead.
biting into the wind. Then another, and another. Soon the sky above the Enterprise was filled with the sound that had come to define America's war in the Pacific. That deep, guttural growl of a Pratt Whitney R2800 double wasp engine at full throttle. Over the radio, Weymouth's voice came through, calm and measured. "Stay tight. Remember, they'll turn sharper, but we hit harder. Patience wins the fight." Minutes later, the formation broke through the clouds. Below them, the scattered remains of a once great empire. Smoke rose from islands that had been strongholds just months before. On the ocean's surface, Japanese convoys burned, their decks littered with debris. The pilots were quiet. There was no joy left in victory, only exhaustion and a strange sense of disbelief. Even among their enemies, admiration had begun to grow. In captured diaries and radio intercepts, American intelligence found phrases that echoed with grudging respect. "The Hellcat pilots fight like demons. Their planes take hits and keep coming. There is no escape." At night, when the engines cooled and the sea was calm, the pilots gathered on the flight deck. Cigarettes glowed in the dark as they leaned against the wings of their planes, talking in low voices about home, about New York, Chicago, Kansas, the places that now felt like another lifetime. They didn't talk about the kills, or the fire, or the sound of metal tearing mid-air, because they all knew the war had turned in their favor, but it hadn't ended. And the closer they got to Japan, the harder it would become. Beneath the stars, the ocean stretched endless and black. The men watched the horizon and listened to the rhythmic hum of the carrier's engines, steady, relentless, eternal. The Hellcat had given them power, but power always comes with a price. Section 7. Waves crashed against the hulls of hundreds of American warships as kamikaze pilots hurled themselves from the clouds in waves of fire. The once feared Japanese Zero, now stripped of its legend, had become a weapon of suicide. On the deck of USS Bunker Hill, pilots of VF-84 prepared their Hellcats for launch. Mechanics moved with precision, faces streaked with oil and salt, the smell of aviation fuel thick in the air. Each man knew the truth. This was not just another battle. This was the last threshold before Japan itself. At 0900 hours, the attack began. Radar screens lit up like constellations. More than 300 enemy aircraft inbound. The alarm screamed across the fleet. "Launch! Launch! Launch!" Engines roared to life. The first Hellcats shot down the deck, claws of steel scraping into the air. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, already an ace with 23 kills, climbed through the clouds with the sun behind him. He spotted the first formation, Zeros diving in pairs toward the fleet. He pressed his trigger. 6 Brownings thundered in unison. One Zero exploded in a ball of flame. Another spiraled into the sea, leaving only smoke and oil behind. Valencia's voice came through the radio, calm but fierce. "Keep the sun behind you. Don't let them touch the ships."
Enemy
But the
UAV
Japanese
overhead.
kept coming. Dozens of kamikazes broke through the flak and dived into American destroyers, erupting in fireballs that shook the ocean. Each impact sent shockwaves through the fleet, a grim reminder that even cornered, the Empire still had claws. Hellcats twisted and dove through the chaos, their wings flashing silver in the light. One pilot, Ensign Fred Mason, locked onto a suicide plane heading straight for a carrier. Out of ammunition, he rammed his Hellcat's wingtip into the enemy's tail, slicing it apart in midair. Both planes went down. It was over in seconds. From the bridge of USS Bunker Hill, Admiral Mark Mitcher watched through binoculars as flames filled the sky. "They fight with death itself," he murmured. A pause. "Then so will we." By sunset, 355 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. The Americans had lost fewer than 30. Yet the victory felt hollow. The Hellcat pilots, now veterans of 3 years of relentless war, returned to their carriers and stepped out of their cockpits in silence. Some stared at the ocean. Others looked toward Japan, a faint outline on the horizon. The war had started in laughter, the enemy mocking the fat, slow American plane. Now there was no laughter left, only the thunder of engines and the ghosts of men who never came home. In the distance, the sun dipped beneath the water, its reflection rippling across the steel decks. Tomorrow they would fly again, and soon it would be over. Section 8. The Last Laugh. August 1945 to Yokosuka, Japan. The war that began in fire was ending in silence. The once mighty airfields of the Empire now lay in ruins. Hangars shattered, runways cracked, and rusting Zero fighters lined up like gravestones under the gray morning light. A single F6F Hellcat circled overhead, its engine purring like a lion at rest. Inside sat Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, a veteran of Coral Sea, Midway, and the Philippine Sea. He looked down at the wreckage below and saw what years of war had carved into the land. Not just defeat, but exhaustion. Below him, a Japanese mechanic stood motionless beside a ruined Zero, its propeller bent, its wings riddled with bullet holes. The man removed his cap and looked up at the Hellcat. For a moment, the two enemies, who had never met but had fought each other across 1,000 miles of sky, shared a look of quiet understanding. It was over. On the decks of USS Enterprise, pilots gathered to watch the rising sun through the haze. There were no cheers, no celebrations. Just the wind, the sea, and the sound of men exhaling after holding their breath for 3 long years. Commander Ralph Weymouth broke the silence. "You know," he said softly, "they laughed when we brought the Hellcat out." Someone chuckled, someone else shook his head, but Weymouth continued, looking toward the horizon. They stopped laughing when it came for them. By the war's end, the F6F Hellcat had achieved what no other fighter in history ever had. More than 5,200 aerial victories, a kill ratio of 19-1, and the destruction of Japan's once feared air arm. It had protected carriers, crushed invasions, and dominated the skies from the Solomons to Okinawa. But its true victory was not in numbers. It was in transformation. The Hellcat represented a nation learning how to fight an industrial war, how to combine courage with mass production, precision with perseverance, and power with humanity.
In the years that followed, the Hellcat became a symbol, not just of American engineering, but of endurance, of how a mocked, overweight prototype became the weapon that broke an empire's wings. When historians looked back, they saw more than metal. They saw men, farm boys, engineers, and dreamers, who climbed into machines built from faith and steel and refused to fall. In a museum decades later, a restored Hellcat sits in perfect silence. Its paint gleams under soft lights, its cockpit empty, its wings folded, as if still waiting for the signal to launch. On its side, someone once scrawled a message in chalk, long since faded but still faintly visible. For every laugh, there's an answer. The laughter of the Japanese commanders in 1943 had echoed across the Pacific. By 1945, that laughter had been drowned out by the roar of Hellcats tearing through the clouds. And in that sound, that deep, rolling thunder, was the story of how a nation rose, how an empire fell, and how the sky itself changed forever.